Hello! Welcome to our channel. Today we have an inspiring story full of life lessons to share. If you enjoy meaningful content, leave a like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. Your opinion means a lot to us. Let's get started with this touching narrative.
Millionaire pretended to lose all his fortune to test his wife. The result was unexpected. Leonardo Montel was a man who seemingly had it all. A thriving tech empire, a sprawling mansion nestled in the hills, and Beatriz, a beautiful and devoted wife. From the outside, their life seemed perfect. Glamorous parties, exotic vacations, and a love story worthy of envy. But beneath Leonardo's polished exterior, doubt had begun to fester. It wasn't always this way. When Leonardo first met Beatriz 5 years ago, he was already wealthy, but not yet the self-made magnate he was now. Beatriz had been a school teacher, her life simple and modest. She had fallen for his charm, his ambition, and his kind heart. But as his empire grew and wealth poured in, Leonardo began to notice subtle changes. Or at least, he thought he did. Her love for luxurious dinners, her delight in designer clothes, the sparkle in her eyes as he surprised her with diamond jewelry. Was it him she cherished, or the lifestyle he provided? For months, Leonardo had tried to dismiss his doubts, calling them irrational and unfair. Beatriz had never given him a reason to suspect her loyalty. Yet, a seed of uncertainty planted by a friend, Marcos, refused to wither. Women change when money's involved, Marcos had said during a casual poker night. You think they love you, but take the money away, and they'll show their true colors. Leonardo had laughed it off at the time, but the words echoed in his mind. As days turned into weeks, the idea morphed into an obsession. What if Beatriz only stayed because of the security he offered? Could their love survive poverty? It was during a quiet Sunday afternoon, as Beatriz tended to the garden, that Leonardo made his decision. He would test her, a cruel, audacious test that would reveal the truth. He would tell Beatriz they were ruined, that a bad investment had wiped out their fortune. He wasn't proud of the plan. In fact, guilt churned in his stomach as he rehearsed his lines in the mirror later that evening. But he convinced himself it was necessary. Better to endure a temporary deception than live a lifetime of doubt. Dinner that night was intimate, just the two of them in their vast dining room. Beatriz had cooked one of Leonardo's favorite meals, roasted chicken with lemon and thyme, accompanied by a bottle of vintage red wine. She was radiant as ever, her dark curls framing her face, her laughter lighting up the room. You've been quiet today, Beatriz said, her voice tinged with concern. Everything okay? Leonardo hesitated, his fork pausing midair. I need to tell you something, he began, setting the utensil down. His heart pounded as he leaned back in his chair, avoiding her gaze. Beatriz's smile faded. What is it, Leo? Is something wrong? He took a deep breath. It's about the company. I made a mistake, a big one. I invested in a venture that backfired. Everything's gone, B. We've lost it all. For a moment, silence hung heavy between them. Beatriz blinked, processing his words. Gone, she echoed, her voice barely above a whisper. Leonardo nodded, his throat dry. The house, the cars, the bank accounts. We'll have to sell everything to cover the debts. I'm sorry, Beatriz. I failed you. Her initial reaction wasn't what he expected. There was no anger, no hysteria. Instead, she reached across the table, her hand finding his. Leo, how long have you been carrying this alone? Her question caught him off guard. A while, he admitted, surprised by the tremor in his own voice. You should have told me sooner, she said gently. We're in this together, remembers? Her words pierced his heart. This wasn't the reaction he'd braced for. He had envisioned tears, maybe accusations, or even quiet resentment. But here she was, calm and steadfast, her hand still resting on his. "Do we have a plan?" Beatriz asked after a moment. Leonardo fumbled for a response. He hadn't thought that far ahead. "We'll have to downsize. I've already spoken to a realtor about selling the house." Beatriz nodded, though he noticed the brief flicker of sadness in her eyes. "That makes sense. We can rent a small apartment for now. Something manageable. And I can start looking for work again, teaching, maybe." "You'd go back to work?" he asked, surprised. "Of course," she said with a small smile. "I loved teaching. And besides, it's not just about us, Leo. We have to rebuild together. This isn't the end. It's just a new chapter." Leonardo could barely process her words. Was this genuine? Could anyone be this composed in the face of losing everything? Over the next week, Beatriz took charge in ways Leonardo hadn't anticipated. She packed up their belongings, organized the sale of their furniture, and contacted a few old friends for job leads. She even set up a budget spreadsheet, detailing how they could stretch the small savings he claimed to have left. But it wasn't her efficiency that left him shaken. It was her attitude. She never complained, never asked why this had happened to them. Instead, she remained optimistic, often reminding him that money wasn't the foundation of their relationship. One night, as they sat on the floor of their now mostly empty living room, eating takeout from paper boxes, Beatriz leaned against his shoulder. "You know," she said, her tone light, "I've been thinking about that trip we took to the countryside when we first started dating. Remember how we got lost and ended up staying in that tiny bed and breakfast?" Leonardo smiled at the memory. "The one with the creaky floors and the questionable plumbing?" Beatriz laughed. "Yes, that one. We didn't have much back then, but it was one of the happiest weekends of my life." He turned to look at her, his chest tightening. "Why?" "Because we had each other," she said simply. "And that's all we really need, Leo." Her words, so earnest and sincere, were both a balm and a dagger. A balm for the doubts that had plagued him, and a dagger for the guilt he carried. How could he have doubted her? By the time they moved into the small, two-bedroom apartment, Leonardo was struggling to maintain the facade. Every moment he spent with Beatriz only deepened his remorse. She was resourceful, loving, and resilient in ways he hadn't fully appreciated before. Yet, as much as he admired her, he couldn't bring himself to reveal the truth. Not yet. That night, as Beatriz unpacked a box of kitchenware, Leonardo watched her from across the room. The dim light softened her features, and he felt a wave of emotion so powerful it nearly brought him to his knees. He had set out to test her love, but the test had turned on him. It wasn't Beatriz who needed to prove herself. It was him. The move to the small apartment in the outskirts of the city was a jarring shift for Leonardo. The sprawling estate they once called home, with its polished marble floors, infinity pool, and the gentle hum of staff tending to their every need, was now a distant memory. In its place was a modest building with peeling paint, narrow hallways, and neighbors whose muffled conversations seeped through thin walls. For Beatriz, however, it seemed to be just another adjustment. For Leonardo, it was a stark descent into the unfamiliar. The first night in the apartment was restless. The furniture they'd kept barely filled the small space, and their once luxurious king-sized bed had been traded for a second-hand queen that creaked with the slightest movement. As Leonardo lay staring at the cracked ceiling, the reality of his charade pressed down on him. He had orchestrated this upheaval, and now he was trapped in it. Beside him, Beatriz slept soundly, her breathing steady and peaceful. She had spent the day unpacking, meticulously arranging their belongings in the cramped kitchen and the tiny bedroom. The sight of her humming as she worked, smiling despite their circumstances, had only deepened the ache in his chest. The next morning, Leonardo woke to the smell of coffee. He found Beatriz in the kitchen, pouring 2 mugs of the cheap instant brand she'd picked up at the grocery store. She greeted him with a bright smile, as if they weren't living in a fraction of the space they once had. "I thought we could explore the neighborhood today," she said, handing him a mug. "There's a little park down the street. It might be nice to take a walk." Leonardo nodded absently, sipping the bitter coffee. He didn't have the heart to tell her that he wasn't in the mood for parks or walks. His thoughts were consumed by the logistics of the lie he'd created. What would he say if she asked about the supposed debts? How long could he keep this going before confessing? As if reading his mind, Beatriz placed a hand on his arm. "Leo, we're going to be okay. I know this is hard, but we'll get through it. Together." Her words, so genuine, struck him like a blow. How could she be so unwavering when he was the one faltering? Over the next few days, Leonardo watched Beatriz adapt to their new life with a mixture of admiration and disbelief. She didn't just accept their circumstances, she embraced them. She learned the bus routes, found a local market where the vegetables were fresh and cheap, and even befriended the elderly woman who lived next door. One evening, as they shared a simple dinner of rice and beans, Beatriz surprised him with a proposition. "I've been thinking," she began, swirling her fork in her food. "I should start working again." Leonardo looked up, startled. "You don't have to do that, Bea. I can handle this." She smiled, but there was determination in her eyes. "I know you can, but it's not about what you can or can't handle. It's about us working together. I like teaching Leo. It made me feel like I was contributing to something meaningful. This could be a fresh start for both of us." Her resolve left him speechless. He wanted to argue, to tell her that none of this was real and she didn't need to make such sacrifices. But instead, he nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. True to her word, Beatriz wasted no time. She dug out her old resume and updated it, crafting cover letters late into the night while Leonardo pretended to work on business plans. Within a week, she landed an interview at a small private school nearby. The morning of the interview, Leonardo watched her get ready, her movements purposeful and confident. She wore a simple blouse and skirt, her makeup minimal but polished. As she stood by the door, clutching her bag, she turned to him with a smile. "Wish me luck." "You don't need it," he said softly. "You're going to do great." Her face lit up, and for a moment, Leonardo forgot about the lie that hung between them. While Beatriz was at her interview, Leonardo wandered the apartment, restless and uneasy. The silence was oppressive, giving his thoughts room to spiral. He replayed every moment of their time together since the fall, scrutinizing her reactions, her words, her actions. No matter how hard he looked, he couldn't find a single sign of resentment or deceit. Around noon, Beatriz returned, her cheeks flushed and her eyes sparkling. "I got the job," she announced, throwing her arms around him. Leonardo held her tightly, a mix of pride and guilt flooding his chest. "That's amazing, Bea. I knew you would. They said I can start next week," she continued, her excitement bubbling over. "It's not much, but it's a start." As she rattled off details about the school, her new colleagues, and the students she would be teaching, Leonardo couldn't help but marvel at her resilience. She wasn't just surviving this supposed downfall, she was thriving. The days turned into weeks, and their new routine began to take shape. Beatriz threw herself into her teaching, often coming home with stories about her students that made her laugh until her eyes watered. She never once complained about their cramped apartment or their limited means. Leonardo, meanwhile, struggled to maintain the illusion of his own busy life. He pretended to spend hours working on freelance consulting projects, but in reality, he spent most of his time pacing the apartment or sitting in the park, lost in thought. The weight of the deception was becoming unbearable. One afternoon, as they walked home from the market, Beatriz stopped abruptly and turned to him. "Leo, are you okay?" she asked, her brow furrowed with concern. He hesitated. "Why do you ask?" "You've been distant lately. Quieter than usual." He forced a smile. "Just a lot on my mind." Beatriz studied him for a moment before nodding. "I understand. But you don't have to carry this alone, you know. We're a team." Her words, so simple and sincere, were like a knife twisting in his chest. He wanted to tell her everything, to confess the truth and beg for her forgiveness. But every time he opened his mouth to speak, fear held him back. One evening, as they sat in the living room with a bottle of cheap wine, Beatriz brought up a memory that caught him off guard. "Do you remember our first apartment together?" she asked, her eyes distant with nostalgia. Leonardo chuckled. "The one with the leaky roof and the neighbors who played music at all hours?" Beatriz laughed. "Yes, that one. We didn't have much back then, but we were happy. We made it work." "We did," he agreed, his voice tinged with melancholy. She reached for his hand, her touch warm and reassuring. "We'll make this work too, Leo. Money comes and goes, but what we have, that's what matters." Her words haunted him long after she fell asleep that night. He had set out to test her love, but the test had revealed something he hadn't anticipated: the depth of her strength and the purity of her heart. The weight of his deception pressed down on him, heavier than ever. How much longer could he keep this up? The weeks passed, and the tiny apartment began to feel less like a temporary shelter and more like home. Beatriz filled the space with small touches: a potted plant on the windowsill, thrifted throw pillows on the worn-out couch, and framed photos from their early days together. She even convinced Leonardo to hang a string of fairy lights in the kitchen, giving their modest dinners a warm, intimate glow. For Beatriz, it was a fresh start. She poured her energy into her new teaching job, waking up early each morning with a smile and returning late in the afternoon with stories about her students. Leonardo marveled at her ability to find joy even in the simplest moments. For him, however, the weight of the lie had grown unbearable. He spent most days pretending to work on freelance projects, though in truth, he spent hours in solitude, his thoughts spiraling. Guilt consumed him, but fear kept him silent. What if confessing the truth now shattered the trust Beatriz had shown him? What if the woman he had underestimated finally reached her breaking point? One evening, Beatriz returned home with an envelope in her hand and a determined look on her face. "Guess what?" she said, setting her bag down and waving the envelope in front of him. "What's that?" Leonardo asked, his curiosity piqued. "I got my first paycheck," she announced, tearing it open with a grin. Leonardo smiled, though the sight of the modest sum printed on the slip filled him with shame. She had given up her comfort and security because of his deception. Now she was supporting them while he lived in the shadow of his own cowardice. Beatriz didn't seem to notice his inner turmoil. She was already talking excitedly about how they could use the money. "We can finally replace the toaster," she said with a laugh. "And maybe we could go out for dinner. Something simple like that little Italian place we passed the other day." Leonardo nodded, his throat tight. "That sounds great." As she chattered on, Leonardo's eyes drifted to her hands. He noticed her engagement ring, once a brilliant diamond centerpiece, now missing its stone. He said suddenly, interrupting her. "Where's your ring?" She paused, her smile faltering.
Oh,
"I sold the diamond last week." "You what?" "I didn't think you'd mind," she said, her voice calm but careful. "We needed the money, and it felt wrong keeping something so extravagant when we're trying to rebuild." Leonardo stared at her, his chest tightening. She had given up one of her most cherished possessions without hesitation. "You didn't have to do that," he said softly, guilt twisting his stomach. "Yes, I did," Beatriz replied, reaching for his hand. "It's just a thing, Leo. What matters is us. I'd trade 1,000 diamonds to make sure we're okay." Beatriz's sacrifices didn't stop there. Over the next few weeks, Leonardo noticed her working late into the night, grading papers and preparing lesson plans by the dim glow of a desk lamp. Her energy never wavered, but there were small signs of exhaustion that didn't escape his notice. The dark circles under her eyes, the way she rubbed her temples when she thought he wasn't looking. One night, he found her sitting at the kitchen table, her head resting on a stack of papers. She had fallen asleep mid-sentence, a red pen still clutched in her hand. The sight of her, so determined and yet so vulnerable, was almost too much to bear. Leonardo gently took the pen from her hand and placed a blanket over her shoulders. As he stood there, watching her sleep, a thought struck him with startling clarity. Beatriz deserved better than this. He had pushed her into this life, stolen the security and comfort she had earned by standing by his side. She had proven her love 100 times over, and yet he continued to withhold the truth. What puzzled Leonardo most, however, were the moments when Beatriz seemed to disappear. Once or twice a week, she would leave the apartment after dinner, offering vague explanations about errands or visits to friends. She always returned with the same reassuring smile, but Leonardo couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. One evening, after she left with her usual "don't wait up for me," Leonardo's curiosity got the better of him. He decided to follow her. It wasn't difficult to track Beatriz. She had taken the bus to a neighborhood a few miles away. Leonardo kept his distance, careful not to be seen. He watched as she entered a small, unassuming building with frosted glass windows and a hand-painted sign that read Community Legal Aid Center. His mind raced. What was she doing there? Was she consulting a lawyer? Had she grown suspicious of his story? The idea that Beatriz might be planning her escape filled him with dread. Unable to resist, Leonardo waited outside until she emerged nearly an hour later. She was holding a manila folder and wore a thoughtful expression. She didn't see him as she walked to the bus stop and boarded her ride home. Leonardo didn't confront her that night. Instead, he lay awake, his thoughts churning. Had his deception driven her to seek legal advice? Was she preparing for a divorce? The thought of losing her, of truly losing her, was unbearable. The next morning, as Beatriz prepared for work, Leonardo decided to confront her. He began, his voice hesitant. "I noticed you've been going out a lot lately. Is everything okay?" She paused, glancing at him with a hint of surprise. "Of course. Why do you ask?" "You went to that legal aid center last night," he said carefully, watching her reaction. Beatriz's eyes widened slightly, but she quickly composed herself. "You followed me?" I was worried," he admitted. "I thought maybe you were in trouble or thinking of leaving." Her expression softened, and she reached out to take his hand. "Leo, I'm not going anywhere. I went to the center because I've been trying to sort out something that could help us." "What do you mean?" Beatriz hesitated for a moment before explaining. "A few years ago, before we met, I inherited a small piece of land from my grandparents. It's not much, but it's worth something. I've been meeting with a lawyer to see if I can sell it." Leonardo stared at her, speechless. "I wanted to surprise you," she continued. "I thought maybe the money could help us get back on our feet." Tears burned in Leonardo's eyes as her words sank in. Even now, with everything she had given up, she was still thinking of ways to help him. "You don't have to do that, B," he said, his voice trembling. "You've already done so much." "It's not about what I have to do," she replied gently. "It's about what I want to do for us." That night, Leonardo sat alone in the living room, staring at the fairy lights Beatriz had hung weeks ago. Her selflessness, her resilience, her unwavering love. It was more than he deserved. The charade had gone too far. It was time to end it. The morning sun filtered through the thin curtains of their small apartment, casting a soft glow on the modest living room. Leonardo sat at the dining table, staring at the mug of coffee growing cold in his hands.
Today was the day.
He had made his decision in the stillness of the previous night. He would confess everything. The weight of his deception had grown too heavy to carry. Beatriz had sacrificed so much for him, her comfort, her stability, even her cherished possessions. She had given without hesitation, standing steadfast through the storm he had created. It was time to repay her trust with the truth, no matter the consequences. As if summoned by his thoughts, Beatriz emerged from the bedroom, tying her hair into a loose bun. She glanced at him with her usual bright smile. "You're up early," she remarked, leaning down to kiss his cheek. "Everything okay?" Leonardo hesitated. He wanted to speak, but the words caught in his throat. The warmth of her kiss, the casual way she trusted him, made the confession even harder to begin. "I was just thinking," he finally said, his voice uneven. "About what?" Beatriz asked, pouring herself a cup of coffee. "About us." She paused, turning to face him. "What about us?" Leonardo took a deep breath, steeling himself. "There's something I need to tell you, B. Something I should have told you a long time ago." Her brow furrowed slightly, concern flashing in her eyes as she set her cup down. "You're scaring me, Leo. What's going on?" Leonardo gestured for her to sit, and she obeyed, watching him intently. For a moment, he simply stared at her, trying to find the right words. "When I told you we lost everything," he began slowly. "It wasn't true?" Beatriz blinked, her expression unreadable. "What do you mean?" "I didn't lose our fortune," he continued, his voice trembling. "The company is fine. The investments are fine. We're not bankrupt. It was all a lie." Her reaction wasn't immediate. She sat frozen, her lips slightly parted as if she couldn't quite process what he had just said. Then, slowly, her brows knit together, and her eyes darkened with confusion and hurt. "You lied to me," she whispered. "Yes," Leonardo admitted, shame washing over him. "I lied. I thought I needed to test you, to see if you loved me for me or for the life I could provide." Beatrice stared at him, silent and motionless. The weight of her gaze was unbearable, and Leonardo felt his chest tighten as he continued. "I know it was wrong," he said, his voice breaking. "I know I betrayed your trust. But I had to know, B. I had to be sure." "And what did you find out?" she asked, her voice cold and distant. "That I was a fool," he replied, tears brimming in his eyes. "That you loved me more than I ever deserved. You gave up everything, B. Your ring, your comfort, even your dreams, to help me. And I repaid you with lies." Beatrice finally stood, pushing her chair back with a scrape. She paced the small space, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "I don't even know what to say," she said after a moment. "Do you have any idea what you put me through, Leonardo? I gave up everything because I believed we were in this together. And all along you were watching me like I was some kind of experiment." "I know," Leonardo said, rising from his chair. "I know I hurt you, and I'll spend the rest of my life making it up to you if you'll let me." "Do you think an apology fixes this?" she asked, her voice rising. "Do you think saying I'm sorry erases the sleepless nights, the sacrifices, the tears?" "No," he admitted. "It doesn't. But I had to tell you the truth. You deserve that much." The silence that followed was deafening. Beatrice stood with her back to him, her shoulders trembling. Leonardo wanted to reach for her, to comfort her, but he knew he didn't have the right. After what felt like an eternity, Beatrice turned to face him. Her eyes were wet with unshed tears, but there was a fire in her gaze that sent a chill down his spine. "You wanted to test me?" she said, her voice quiet but firm.
"Fine.
Here's my answer. I love you, Leonardo. I loved you when we had everything, and I loved you when I thought we had nothing. But love isn't a game, and trust isn't something you can just throw away because of your insecurities." Leonardo's throat tightened. "I know I've broken your trust, B, and I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. But please, give me a chance to make this right." Beatrice shook her head, her expression weary. "I don't know if I can, Leo. Not right now. I need time to figure out what this means for me, for us." Her words hit him like a blow, but he nodded. "Take all the time you need," he said softly. "I'll be here. I'll wait for as long as it takes." The days that followed were a blur of tension and uncertainty. Beatrice didn't leave, but the warmth that had once filled their home was gone. She spoke to him only when necessary, and even then, her tone was distant. Leonardo, for his part, gave her space. He spent his days working, truly working this time, pouring his energy into the company he had neglected during his self-imposed charade. At night, he lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if he had destroyed the very thing he had sought to protect. One evening, about a week after his confession, Beatrice came home with a small bag of groceries. She set them on the counter without a word, but instead of retreating to the bedroom as she had in recent days, she turned to face him. "I've been thinking," she began, her voice calm but measured. Leonardo looked up from his laptop, his heart pounding. "About what?" "About us," she said, folding her arms across her chest. "About what you did and why you did it." He set the laptop aside, giving her his full attention. "And I'm still angry," she admitted. "I don't know if I'll ever stop being angry. But I also can't ignore everything we've been through together. Leonardo rose, his pulse quickening. Let me finish, she interrupted. What you did was wrong, Leo. It was selfish and cruel, and it hurt me more than I can put into words. But I also see the man you're trying to be now. The man who's willing to own up to his mistakes and fight for what he loves. Hope flickered in his chest, fragile but growing. Does that mean you'll give me another chance? Beatriz sighed, her expression softening. It means I'm willing to try. But it's going to take time, Leo. Trust isn't rebuilt overnight. I'll do whatever it takes, he promised, his voice thick with emotion. Beatriz stepped closer, her gaze steady. I'll hold you to that. The next few weeks were filled with careful steps forward, each one tentative but meaningful. Beatriz hadn't left, but her words had been clear. Trust would take time to rebuild. Leonardo took her at her word. Every gesture, every action became a quiet effort to show her the sincerity of his remorse. The air between them remained heavy at first, conversations brief and practical. But in the silence, Leonardo noticed something unexpected. Beatriz wasn't shutting him out entirely. Instead, she seemed to be observing him, as if searching for proof that his promises were more than hollow words. One evening, while Beatriz worked on lesson plans at the kitchen table, Leonardo approached her cautiously. He carried a notebook in his hands, its edges worn from being handled repeatedly. He said softly, breaking the silence. She looked up, her pen pausing mid-stroke. Yes. There's something I want to show you, he began, his voice hesitant. It's part of how I'm trying to make things right. She set her pen down and gestured for him to continue. Leonardo handed her the notebook, his palms slightly sweaty. It's a plan. For us. Beatriz opened the notebook, her expression unreadable as she scanned the pages. Inside were detailed outlines of how Leonardo intended to move forward. A budget for the next 6 months, steps to contribute to the household without relying on her income, and even ideas for small trips to rebuild their connection. At the bottom of the first page, he had written a note. I'm ready to put in the work to earn your trust again. Not because I expect forgiveness, but because you deserve the best of me. Beatriz's eyes lingered on the words, her lips pressing into a thin line. When she finally looked up, there was a flicker of emotion in her gaze, something softer, more vulnerable than he had seen in weeks. You've been busy, she said, her voice quiet. I had to be, Leonardo admitted. I didn't just lose your trust, Bea. I lost sight of the man I want to be. The man you fell in love with. She closed the notebook gently and met his eyes. This is a good start, Leo. But it's not just about plans. I need to see consistency. I need to know you mean this, not just now, but months from now. I understand, he said, his voice firm. And I'll prove it to you. Leonardo's words weren't just promises, they became actions. He began taking on freelance projects again, ensuring that his work didn't interfere with Beatriz's contributions. He started handling more of the household chores, cooking meals, and even helping her organize her classroom supplies. One Saturday morning, as Beatriz prepared to leave for a parent-teacher meeting, she found Leonardo at the kitchen counter, carefully packing her lunch. What's this? She asked, raising an eyebrow. Just a little something to keep you going, he said with a shy smile. I figured you'd have a busy day. Beatriz accepted the lunchbox, her lips twitching into a reluctant smile. Thank you, Leo. That's thoughtful. Her response, though understated, filled him with a flicker of hope. Every small victory mattered. Despite their progress, there was still one lingering question that haunted Leonardo: Beatriz's land inheritance. He knew she had been working with a lawyer to sell the property, but she hadn't mentioned it since his confession. Part of him feared she was still holding back, unsure if she could trust him with something so significant. One evening, as they sat together on the couch, Beatriz reading and Leonardo reviewing documents for a new project, he decided to bring it up. Bea, he began cautiously, can I ask you something? She glanced up from her book. Of course. It's about the land you mentioned. The one you were planning to sell. Beatriz set the book aside, her expression thoughtful. What about it? I want you to know you don't have to sell it. Not for me, not for us. I'll make sure we're okay without it. Her gaze softened, and she reached for his hand. I already made up my mind about the land, Leo. I'm not selling it anymore. Leonardo blinked, surprised. You're not? No, she said with a small smile. When you told me the truth, it changed everything. That land was my safety net, something I thought I needed because I couldn't rely on anything else. But now, I want to believe we can rebuild without having to sacrifice everything that matters. Leonardo's chest tightened. Her words were a quiet testament to the progress they had made, a sign that trust was beginning to take root again. A few nights later, Beatriz surprised him with an idea of her own. I've been thinking, she said as they cleaned up after dinner. Maybe we should take a weekend trip, just the two of us? Leonardo looked at her in surprise. Really? She nodded, a hint of a smile playing on her lips. We've been through a lot, Leo. Maybe it's time to take a breath, reconnect. Nothing fancy, just something simple like we used to do. His heart swelled at her suggestion. I'd like that, he said softly. They spent the next few days planning their getaway, eventually settling on a small cabin near the countryside. It was modest but charming, surrounded by rolling hills and quiet woods. When they arrived at the cabin, Beatriz was the first to step out of the car, her face lighting up at the sight of the lush greenery. It's perfect, she said, turning to Leonardo with a genuine smile. As they unpacked and settled in, Leonardo felt a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in months. The cabin's simplicity reminded him of their early days together, when love had been enough to fill every corner of their lives. That evening, as they sat by the fire, Beatriz leaned her head on his shoulder. Thank you for coming with me, she said softly. Thank you for giving me the chance, he replied, his voice thick with emotion. She looked up at him, her eyes searching his. I'm still scared, Leo. Scared that we'll fall back into old patterns. Scared that this trust we're rebuilding might not last. I'm scared too, he admitted. But I promise you, B, I'll never take you for granted again. You're the best thing that's ever happened to me. Her lips curved into a small smile. Let's take it one step at a time, then. Together, he said, squeezing her hand. As the fire crackled softly and the night wrapped around them, Leonardo felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. The trip to the countryside marked a turning point for Leonardo and Beatriz. It wasn't just a getaway, it was a moment to reflect, to heal, and to rediscover what had brought them together in the first place. As they drove back to the city, the quiet tension that had lingered between them for weeks seemed lighter, replaced by something fragile but undeniably hopeful. Back in their apartment, they began to rebuild their lives with renewed purpose. The conversations that had once been distant became warmer, filled with laughter and moments of shared understanding. Leonardo no longer shied away from discussing his feelings, and Beatriz, in turn, began to trust him again, piece by piece. One evening, as they sat on the couch, Beatriz turned to him with a thoughtful expression. You know, she began, I've been thinking about our future. Leonardo's heart skipped a beat. What about it? I don't want us to just go back to the way things were, she said. I want something different, something more meaningful. Maybe we could use what we've learned to do something good, not just for us, but for others. What do you mean? He asked, intrigued. Beatriz's eyes sparkled with excitement. You've built a successful business, Leo. And I've worked with so many students who come from families struggling to make ends meet. What if we created a foundation, something that could help kids, provide scholarships, or support families in need? Leonardo's chest swelled with pride and admiration. Once again, Beatriz had shown him the depth of her heart and her vision. That's an incredible idea, he said, taking her hand. Let's do it together. Over the following months, Leonardo and Beatriz poured their energy into creating the foundation. They called it the Second Chance Initiative, a name that reflected not only their mission but also their journey as a couple. Leonardo used his business acumen to secure funding and partnerships, while Beatriz brought her passion and insight from her years as a teacher. Together, they created programs to provide educational resources, mentorship opportunities, and financial assistance to underserved communities. The work wasn't easy, but it was fulfilling. For the first time in years, They felt like they were truly aligned, not just as partners in life, but as partners in purpose. One evening, as the foundation celebrated its first major milestone, Leonardo surprised Beatriz with a private dinner in the very first restaurant they had visited as a couple. The memories of that night came rushing back. The nervous excitement, the laughter, the shared dreams of a future that had seemed so distant then. As the evening wound down, Leonardo reached across the table, his expression serious but tender. "Bea," he said softly, "I know we've been through so much. I've made mistakes that I'll never stop trying to make up for. But I need you to know how much I love you, how grateful I am that you stayed, that you believed in us." Beatriz's eyes shimmered with emotion. "I love you too, Leo. And I believe in us because you've shown me that you're willing to grow, to fight for what matters." He smiled, reaching into his pocket and pulling out a small velvet box. "I thought it was time to give this back to you properly." Inside the box was her engagement ring, its diamond replaced with a new, brilliant stone. Beatriz gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Leo." "I know it's just a symbol," he said, his voice steady. "But I hope it reminds you every day of my commitment to you, to us, and to the life we're building together." Beatriz's tears spilled over as she nodded, letting him slip the ring onto her finger. It wasn't just a renewal of their vows. It was a promise of a future forged in trust, love, and shared purpose. As they walked out of the restaurant hand in hand, Leonardo felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. He had set out on a reckless journey to test Beatriz's love, but it was he who had been tested. And in the process, he had discovered something far more valuable than wealth or security. He had rediscovered the woman who had always been his greatest treasure. Their story wasn't about perfection, it was about perseverance. And as they stepped into the night, Leonardo knew that their best chapters were still ahead. Thank you so much for reading Millionaire Pretended to Lose Everything to Test His Wife. The result was unexpected. We hope you enjoyed this heartfelt journey of love, trust, and redemption as much as we enjoyed creating it for you. If this story touched you in any way, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below to share your favorite moment or what resonated most with you. Like this story if it brought a smile to your face or warmed your heart. Subscribe to our channel for more captivating stories about love, growth, and the twists of fate that shape us all. Your feedback helps us grow and continue to bring you stories that inspire and entertain. Until next time, keep believing in the power of love.